So now we're going to talk about a couple of steps backwards for civil rights for African Americans in the United States. And these steps backwards came through two Supreme Court decisions. One is called the Civil Rights Cases of 1883. One is called Plessy v. Ferguson, which was decided in 1896. The first one, the Civil Rights Cases. Now, that's the name of a specific Supreme Court case. I know it's a confusing name, but that's the name, the Civil Rights Cases. The Supreme Court in this case decided that the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was unconstitutional. And the reason that they decided this is that they found that it is an individual's right to discriminate, that there's nothing in the Constitution that says that an individual cannot discriminate against another individual. So they struck down the Civil Rights Act of 1875 in this case, again called the Civil Rights Cases. The second really important Supreme Court case is called Plessy v. Ferguson, and that one was heard in 1896. And Plessy v. Ferguson, the facts of the case are this. There was a gentleman by the name of Homer Plessy who was African American. He was actually multiracial. And he sat in a railroad car that was set up for whites only. So it was a segregated railroad, and he sat in a car that was marked as whites only, and he was arrested. And ultimately, what the court found in Plessy versus Ferguson is that as long as there are separate but equal accommodations set up for people of different races, that was okay. So the Civil Rights Cases finds that it's constitutionally acceptable for an individual to discriminate against another individual based on race. And Plessy versus Ferguson, the court finds that racial segregation is constitutionally acceptable as long as those accommodations are, quote, separate but equal. So, to summarize, all of those things that you may think of as being immoral, highly problematic, unjust, that took place in the Jim Crow South were all set up by this legal framework through these two Supreme Court decisions. Now, this is an example that I set forth as why it is okay to question laws that are passed from time to time. In other words, laws are not always just. Laws are not always moral. Because again, all of these things that we think of today as being immoral and unjust were all perfectly legal. And it's these two cases that set up the legal framework for all of these things that we think of as being immoral and unjust that took place in the Jim Crow South. Now, the next step in setting up the Jim Crow South was to create a situation that would nullify the 15th Amendment. In other words, to make it so African American people could not vote. So there was a project of voter disenfranchisement. This word disenfranchisement means the opposite of to give somebody the vote. When somebody is granted the right to vote, we say that person has gained franchise. So there were three tools that were used to prevent African American people from being able to legally vote in a lot of the country. So the first tool for voter disenfranchisement is called poll taxes. So that meant that in order to vote, you needed to pay a certain amount of money, a tax. The second tool used for voter disenfranchisement were called literacy tests or IQ tests that were nearly impossible for anyone to pass. Now, it's also important to note that if you were Caucasian, you didn't need to pay the poll tax, and you didn't need to take the literacy test in order to vote. And the reason for this is, along with these laws was included what is called the grandfather clause. And that meant that if your grandfather could legally vote, then you were exempt from having to take a literacy test, and you didn't have to pay a poll tax. So obviously, at this time, African American men, their grandfathers didn't have the right to vote because they were enslaved. So it was only African Americans that needed to take these literacy tests in order to vote or to pay a poll tax in order to vote. And then the third tool of voter disenfranchisement was called white primaries. And this meant that the political parties, the Democrats and Republicans, only allowed white people to vote in primary elections. And the rationale for this, or I should say, the legal way that these political parties got away with it, is they said that we are social clubs. That's what political parties branded themselves as. We are social clubs. And because of the civil rights cases that was decided by the Supreme Court, private organizations had the right to discriminate, or I should say, the legal authority to discriminate. So this prevented African Americans from voting in primary elections. Primary elections are how political parties choose their candidates for general elections. And if you have no power in selecting the people that you're going to be able to choose between, then certainly you don't really have much power in making that ultimate decision of who should be your governor or your senator or the president of the United States. So again, these are three tools for voter disenfranchisement that took place. Number one is called poll taxes, in which you had to pay money in order to vote. Another was called literacy tests, in which you needed to show that you had a high enough IQ in order to vote. And remember, for both of those, if your grandfather could legally vote, then you didn't need to pay the tax or take the literacy test. That was called the grandfather clause. And then the third tool of voter disenfranchisement is called white primaries, in which only white people could vote in primary elections.